here is to have a semi-formal conversation on something that I came across a few years ago that was really celebrated at times, but I think our guests today will tell us how it was taken in. As I shared earlier, the RSC is attempting to, however perfectly or not, to confront how such things as Indigenous engagement, whether it's within our pillar of commitment to inclusive engagement or not, it is, how Indigenous engagement may be resident, acted upon, enabled in the Royal Society of Canada. There's a lot of branches to that, but I could only speak about it principally from my own experience. I've only been with the RSC since 2019, I think, as I entered the college. But as it happens, there's a great deal of history going on with the genesis of and the activities of the Royal Society of Canada. In 2021, Constance Backhouse, Cynthia Milton, Margaret Kovach, and Adele Perry co-edited the volume Royally Wronged, the Royal Society of Canada and the Marginalization of Indigenous Knowledge. And this is available still through McGill Queen's University's Press, and you ought to have received a copy in the bags you got at registration. If you don't, you can go outside the registration and get a copy. So today's discussion is hoped to reflect upon the findings, aspirations, and origins of the book, which in Cindy Blackstock's and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action for institutional reckoning. So this book might be understood as an outworking of, at least in part, those calls for confronting the issues of how Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge has been resident or not in the Royal Society of Canada. I want to make mention of something that was mentioned by Marie earlier today. The RSC had received from Marie and others the knowledge systems report that has been a topic of conversation. Institutions like ours take time to confront these sorts of things, but it was well received, and we could speak about that tomorrow more thoroughly. But we have before us here the co-authors of that. So I hope you'll tolerate a brief introduction of each of you, because I think it's really important. So, the one who's gesturing to me, keep it short. Constance Backhouse is a distinguished university professor of law at the University of Ottawa. She was named to the Order of Canada in 2008 and the Order of Ontario in 2010, and has been a fellow of the RSC since 2004 and served as president of its Academy of Social Sciences from 2015 to 2017. Welcome. Watwanulado, as we say. Margaret Kovach, is an Indigenous scholar of Nihilua and Saulteaux ancestry from Treaty 4, Saskatchewan. She's currently a professor in the Department of Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver campus. And her scholarly interests include Indigenous research methodologies, higher education approaches to Indigenous education, and social justice education. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. Cynthia Milton is a professor of history at the University of Victoria since 2010, fellow of the RSC since 2022, former fellow of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, and former Canada Research Chair in the History Department at the Université de Montréal. And her interdisciplinary research studies alternative modes of historical representations of political violence and the legacies of inequalities and colonialism. Welcome, Cynthia. And finally, Adele Perry is a historian of Canada, colonialism, Indigenous settler relations, and gender. Dr. Perry was raised in a settler family in British Columbia. She completed her PhD in history from York University and joined the University of Manitoba in 2000. She's just a stone's throw away from my office at the U of M. So I think we could keep this somewhat informal, your comments, but there are some questions that I think are really important to this discussion about this volume. And of course, we can't capture everything in the brief time we have together, but I hope we could start with Constance and your contributions to this, and perhaps your understandings of the genesis of the project and its relation to reconciliation.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here and to learn from all of you, both formally and informally, in these sessions. If you ask a historian to talk about origins, it's a dangerous question. So I'm going to go back a little bit to 2004, which is not the start of any of this, when I joined the Royal Society. The fellows, there was no college, and the fellows were almost universally white and male. To my knowledge, there was no Indigenous fellow at all in 2004. My understanding is that John Borrows may have been the first, and he was made a fellow in 2007. So we had a president at the time, Rod MacDonald, now deceased, but very influential for all of us in terms of his promotion of inclusion and diversity. And we started with, I would have to say, a very bleak landscape. There was virtually no interchange between the fellows, the Royal Society, and Indigenous knowledge keepers. In fact, whenever we invited, and that was also extraordinary, to invite an Indigenous knowledge keeper, a respected elder, to come and speak to the Royal Society, the disjunction was evident, both from the audience listening and in the corridors afterwards. Clearly, we had a terrible problem. And the question was, how do you create change? What is the kind of a trigger? And I use that word knowing that we use it in feminism to explain the kind of feelings that discussions about violence have for many women and for men who've been experiencing violence. I want to use it positively here. I think all of us are facing bleak landscapes politically right now. And the question is, what triggers change in the direction we want to see? And so it happened to be that it was Duncan Campbell Scott, who was one of our early presidents, it was the 100th anniversary since he had been elected president of the Royal Society of Canada. And we were lucky enough to have Cindy Blackstock come and speak to us and insist that the TRC task force claims that all of the institutions of knowledge needed to recognize their role in perpetuating the destruction of knowledges from Indigenous communities. She really challenged us, and she said, do something. And consequently, out of that came a Royal Society task force and ultimately a call to arms in terms of writing essays that looked first and foremost at our history. What was wrong? How did we, as a Royal Society from its early formation, create an all-white, all-male academy? And how would we go about making that as a change?
Yeah, for that. I think one of the things that discussion led to was the creation of this pathway of discovery in historical terms about that. And if you have a look through the volume, you'll find some really interesting observations about I'll call them indictments of sorts from the RSC and others. But over to you, Cynthia. I'm wondering if you could summarize some of the principal overall findings and even arguments that are resident in the book.
Great. Thank you, Frank. And thank you again to everyone for sharing your knowledge and offering this space. So you haven't had a chance to read the book yet, I assume, because you just got it in a bag. But I can give you an overview of what it looks like. It's divided into 14 chapters with 4 parts. 2 of the parts are more historical looking. One of the part is the present, and then the other is looking into sort of our aspirational future. And then there's a closing words with by Maggie. So there are several people in the audience who participated in this project, either directly or indirectly. There's Deanna Reeder. There's Marie Baptiste, whose call to arms is in the book as well, and other scholars who've come along in this project. As Constance said, it started out of a task force that made a call for papers from FRSC members, and for the most part, the papers and interest we got were from the academies of the humanities and arts and social sciences, mainly in the Anglophone section, less so in the Francophone section, and almost no reflection, in fact, I think no reflection from science. So there's still, we see this as a work in progress. This is our first iteration of what we think is a kind of work that needs to still be done. We'd love to hear from our fellow societies elsewhere about the work that you're doing in this kind of institutional reckoning. In the case of the Royal Society, I found something shocking, I found something surprising in our findings. Perhaps on the surprising was I just hadn't realized how embedded the Royal Society was in nation formation. So when the Royal Society was founded in 1882 by a royal proclamation, essentially the son-in-law of Queen Victoria helped set it up with the first principal of McGill in a mansion in Montreal, and they brought together their best friends, and they said, we're going to set up a society that's going to represent our intellectual harvest, as they put it, as a new nation. And at this point, the Dominion of Canada is only 14 years old. And then, they realized it can't just be Montreal and Toronto, so they expanded it out. And of course, it is white and it is male. It is Francophone and Anglophone. And they're struggling with how do we identify ourselves as a new nation and what is our intellectual contribution. And they kept seeing themselves falling short compared to England, compared to France, compared to their neighbors to the south. Meanwhile, they were expanding in the nation. And in that expansion, of course, as we know now, was the dispossession of lands and the dispossession of knowledge. And so one of the surprising things for me in the findings that we came to, when I went into the early FRSC records, which are in these leather-bound books called Proceedings and Transactions, and Ian Werley, who's a postdoc, did the same project. Both of us went in thinking, well, there's not going to be a lot of Indigenous knowledge. We were just sort of expecting there to be kind of silence or marginalization. And what we were surprised by was that these early Canadian academics, they were absolutely fascinated with Indigenous knowledge and languages, but they were mining it. They were mining it for what they felt was important, and they were ventriloquizing it. They were parroting or imitating what they thought they had heard, rather than bringing in Indigenous knowledge keepers into the creation of Canadian academia. And so when I read back into these, I think what a different nation and nations we would have been if we had taken that opportunity differently, if we had engaged in a way that had been a conversation and a dialogue rather than what we know now to be extractive knowledge. However, what was surprising was that the very foundation of Canadian academia is a foundation based on Indigenous knowledge. And now we need to go back and undo the harm and bring in that knowledge from the knowledge keepers themselves. So that's the path forward. That's perhaps the surprising. I think what I found shocking in the book. There were certain chapters. There's a chapter on the Brandon residential school burial sites. I found that as a Canadian absolutely shocking. When the book was being published and just about to go to print, the 215 burial sites in Kamloops were just discovered. These are the kind of known unknowns that our history has been silencing. These children and these burial sites were known, but they weren't publicly discussed. And so as the book was coming to print, this was very much in the forefront in the minds. And we do have authors here that were already speaking to that. Other shocking stories, I think, would be your chapter, Adele. Yeah, thank you.
Before we go on, we'll be using Slido for Q&A, but of course, if you're more comfortable using the microphone, we'll do that when Q&A comes. We can't promise as much time as previously because we have an excursion to get to later, but I just wanted to remind you if the Slido app is being used again. Thank you, Cynthia, and you point to some of the examples that really does demonstrate some of the issues that were resident in the FRSC historically. Adele, you had a contribution to this book that may have illustrated that.
Yeah, well, thank you again for the opportunity to kind of extend this conversation. This book was also very much kind of a pandemic project. So it's also an opportunity to see these people who I, had an opportunity to work with and learn from through the curious mechanism of Zoom. It's nice to actually be here in real life amongst all of you here in these territories. But my specific contribution to Royally Wronged is to sort of wade deep into one particular story that connects Duncan Campbell Scott, and by extension the Royal Society he was president of, to the very life-denying and extractive work of Canadian settler colonialism at a particularly formative moment. And I think both this book as a project and my particular part in it suggests something about the work that these kinds of reckonings and reconsideration might play in our larger effort to bring some change to institutions and places across the settler colonial world. There's absolutely no evidence in Scott's archive or in the secondary literature on his work that this particular case that I deal with in the book meant anything in particular to him. It was a story that linked treaties 1 and 3 territories, and it was one of thousands of files that would have come across his desk in his role as Superintendent General of Indian Affairs that he served in from 1913 to 1932. And it had its most immediate origins in shifts in the context of Treaty 1, where the city of Winnipeg found that Indigenous ways of living with waters were no longer sustainable, and they needed a new source of drinking water. And they returned to looking to the Lake of the Woods watershed for plans to build an aqueduct connecting the city of Winnipeg to the Lake of the Woods. And this plan hinged on certain lands that had been reserved for Shoal Lake 40 First Nations, an Anishinaabe community that had signed Treaty 3 a few generations before. A settler historian like myself can piece together some of what happened through the archives left by the Department of Indian Affairs and the men who worked for it, including Scott. Colonial governments couldn't help but leave receipts, and these are ones that we can use as powerful tools for reconstructing the history that has done so much to prop up colonial regimes of the past and of the present. And what we find here, what I found there, was kind of a messy, multi-layered process involving a suite of administrative mechanisms that Canada used to diminish the already extraordinarily modest lands and resources that Indigenous peoples could call their own within Canada. And this included a particularly heavy-handed tool that had been introduced to the Indian Act in 1911 called Section 46, that allowed the federal government to take Indian lands that were deemed necessary for, I quote, public works without even the brittle and very easily manipulated requirements of a surrender process. Scott went back and forth with different authorities within with kind of conflicting interests in the settler project, and ultimately coordinated a process by where the Department of Indian Affairs gave authority to sell, quote unquote, a little over 3,000 acres of Shoal Lake 40's reserve lands and set the price that the First Nation would receive, which was $1,500. This was one of many such land losses that occurred in these years that historians, in particular Sarah Carter at the University of Alberta, are just beginning to really account for. For Shoal Lake 40, this active dispossession essentially trisected the reserve land and rendered it a kind of landlocked artificial island. And this set in motion a series of knock-on effects that would lead to all sorts of consequences, including their inability to sort of secure and sustain drinkable water for their own community. Shoal Lake 40's status of one of Canada's many waterless First Nations stood as a sharp example of how colonialism resources settler communities at the direct expense of Indigenous one. And that Campbell Scott played a key, if somewhat disinterested, role in this process that was an enormously costly one for the First Nation involved is something that the FRSC and those of us who have those initials after our names ought to sit with. Historians aren't often very good at the present, but I think we can characterize the project of Royally Wrong, and my own part in it certainly, as one of the many efforts that are currently ongoing to reckon with Canada's colonial past and what it means in our still colonial present. It has its specific origins in Dr. Cindy Blackstock's powerful request that the RSC live up to the calls of the TRC, a call that we might return to as we mourn TRC Chair, Judge, and Shumas to us all, Murray Sinclair. These efforts mirror global processes, but they have a particular shape in the context of settler colonialism that this gathering is bringing together. When we rename schools and roads, when we remove looming statues, and when we rethink of all the big and small ingredients of the racial wallpaper that kind of provides this powerful backdrop of authority and meaning in our places of work and learning, we are taking part in a wider reckoning with colonialism's ongoing authority and presence. These reckonings, of course, won't bring land back. They will not restore children to their kin and communities. They don't put Indigenous knowledge and sovereignties at the center of how we live in these tender places. But our efforts to bring institutions into better alignment with how we want to live, think, and research in Indigenous lands and with Indigenous peoples are one of the many necessary reckonings that need to happen if we ought to consider better the history that still makes us all. Thank you.
Now for that.
Yeah.
So, living in Winnipeg, as you do too, the awareness of where we receive our water from is something that I'm glad that we're reminded of more and more. And delving into this book, which I did for a previous panel that Cynthia was a part of a couple of years ago, it was kind of alarming in some sense. Not that it happened, of course, it's terrible that government would have that sort of approach to it, but that it's connected historically with institutions such as this was very interesting to me. Margaret Kovach. You had a portion of this book that was really quite interesting about I think it was referred to as the closing circle words, and I'm wondering if you could take us through that. I don't know.
All right.
There you go.
That works.
Here we are.
Yay. Okay. So, Tonze, bonjour, and greetings. I'm Margaret Kovach, but if I see any of you in the hallways, please feel free to call me Maggie. So I want to, before I get going, I want to acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land. I want to acknowledge the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh, upon whose land we gather here today. And I want to say, I'm very constricted with this whole setup. But I want to say, Haichka Siam. Thank you. Thank you for letting us be here today. So, As I mentioned, I'm really restricted with this setup because what's happening here is I've got paper in one hand and mic in the other hand, and I can't talk with my hands. So that's a little bit of a problem for me. But I do want to just share some words on my contribution to this book. I think it's a really it's served. This book has been serving in many ways. And I'm very thankful that I was asked to be a part of this this important work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the closing circle words or the afterword. Just a little bit of a couple of things that I was at the time when we were writing this book that were really front and center for me, and they ended up being in the chapter. They still are front and center for me, and I'll speak to them. But I do want to share just before I mention those few words, and then we can get into a little bit of a dialogue. So yesterday I was back home. I was back home in Saskatchewan. Those big beautiful skies, and I always love going back to Sask, and I was on Treaty 4 territory, and that always does my heart good. And so I actually flew back in today because of this presentation or this panel discussion, plus I have to teach tomorrow. So I flew back in, and so I got to the Regina airport, and I got through security, and I went and grabbed myself a Tim's because I got a little text message saying that the old plane was delayed because apparently there was a lot of rain in Vancouver yesterday morning. So I hear. I don't know if other folks here ran into that same situation. But, as you do, you're sitting in the airport, you got a few free moments. So I took out my iPhone, and I was just getting caught up on my inbox. And so I was scrolling through the inbox, and then there was a note from the First Nations listserv at the University of British Columbia. And the header said, "Sad news." And I feel myself wanting to cry right now. I feel a lump in my throat because that sad news was about the passing of our great leader, our great Canadian leader, our great Canadian Indigenous leader, our Anishinaabe leader. And I always use the term Chief Justice Murray Sinclair, but the Honorable Murray Sinclair passed away yesterday. And I stopped scrolling, and I paused, and I reflected. And I think for many of us Canadians who heard the news yesterday, wherever we were, I think we stopped and we paused and we reflected on the life of Murray Sinclair and all that he has done for us, not only as Indigenous people, but for this country, to bring us together so that we can be in conference gatherings as this, having dialogues as this, where we seek to live together in a way where we are living together peacefully and respecting the dignity of each other. So I'm also an educator. I teach in educational studies at the University of Vancouver, University of Vancouver, sorry about that, UBC Vancouver campus. We always have to situate whether we're at Vancouver campus or Okanagan campus, so I'm at the Vancouver campus. But as I was reflecting on just some of the work that of Murray Sinclair and being an educator, the quote that many of you are familiar with, and I know as educators we are familiar with, the quote that came to mind were the words by Murray Sinclair: "Education got us into this mess. Education will get us out of it." And that's where my mind and my heart was yesterday. I was thinking about, what am I going to say today in my 5 minutes? And it really is true. And I really believe, one of the words in Nahio is tapwe. That means the truth. And one of the truths I know is that we create change when we become aware, when we choose to become aware, when we shed light upon many, many dark shadows. And the treatment of Indigenous peoples in this country is a dark shadow. And the treatment of Indigenous people by the Royal Society of Canada is a dark history. And why I was grateful to be invited to be a part of this work is because I believe we changed the Royal Society of Canada by bringing awareness. And hopefully the book Royally Wronged is about bringing awareness. We change our scholarly institutions by bringing awareness. And hopefully it's conversations like this where we shed light on those dark days, but also that we see the hope and what's changing. And so I reread the book because I hadn't read it for a while, to be honest. I hadn't read the whole thing, let alone my own chapter. But anyway, I took a look at my chapter and I noticed right at the end, I talked about, which was really important for me at the time, was this notion that if we want to change Canadian institutions, Canadian, and particularly I was thinking about Canadian universities, if we wish to ensure that there's an Indigenous presence and Indigenous knowledges are being welcomed, that are being able to uphold our hands, that our Indigenous students are able to see Indigenous knowledges within Canadian institutions, then what we have to do is we have to change tenure and promotion standards within universities. And at the time I wrote this, I was thinking that's a challenge. I'm happy to be here today, though. I'm happy to be here to tell you about some good news, that there is hope, and that we can create change. Just last year, at the University of British Columbia, we ratified our collective agreement. And the employer and the faculty association agreed to language in the collective agreement on Indigenous scholarship. So now the Indigenous scholars, the young Indigenous scholars that are coming through, going for tenure and going for promotion, can now be adjudicated according to an Indigenous scholarship standard. And that's progress. And I was listening to the keynote this morning. Alder Ignacy was talking about the Indigenous Language Act. We make change by ensuring that we have acts and we have policies that can be there to guide us. It's not perfect, but I think that if we are able to continue to do that and then continue to be able to act upon those acts and those policies, we can create change. And I believe that we can flip the switch on Indigenous knowledges in the academy. We can flip that switch from systematic injustice and systemic injustice to systemic justice. But we all have to do our part. Indigenous people, allies, we all have to do our part. And as Murray Sinclair so much gave us a framework for purpose and gave us a framework for hope, is that education and awareness will help us to achieve that end. So thank you very much. Those are my words.
Yeah, thank you very much. So as I said earlier, I've only been with the RSC for a few years, but and I hope I'm not appearing too naive to some to say that I'm cautiously optimistic about change, in part because of your work in the book, some of the contributions that others have made. I've made mention of the Knowledge Systems report that was authored, amongst others, by Marie Baptiste Nyong'o for that and others, and some of the contributions that we make on an ongoing basis to conversations about change. And I think the sorts of change that are thought of can be imagined in a number of different ways. But what I see in this book is almost informing, even governing the principles by which others can imagine a future for our RSC. So not to let too much light in upon institutional magic here, but following TAP, the Tri-Academy Partnership meeting, we have our annual meeting where we'll begin to start thinking about the strategic planning process of the RSC for the next little while. And it seems to me that there's some space within those conversations to really advance a few things. And we've made mention of your book here. We've made mention of it elsewhere. We've made some mention of many of the contributions others made. So it's been really wonderful. So again, a big nyongo to your work. It might have been a pandemic project to pass the time when you're locked up at home, but it really did inform many. So nyongo for that. The Slido app may be used if you want to contribute to this, or if you want to simply come up to the mic, that'd be lovely. I do want to make mention of a couple of things, though, because the book before us has this really lovely artwork on the cover that is frankly striking and juxtaposed the Royal Society wording on the cover. So perhaps this is a question for, and I see people are motioning towards Cynthia. What can you tell us about this artwork?
Thank you. So the artwork is by Coast Salish artist Shain Jackson, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, but he has an organization that he calls the Golden Eagle Rising, and it's here in Vancouver, and some of his artwork is there, as well as an Indigenous health center that he's helping to get started within his community. So the artwork that you see is it's of a double-headed golden eagle, the two heads representing male, female, as well as two spirits. And the eagle has horns on it that are to represent justice and leadership. I don't want to do something that all settlers do, which is ventriloquize. And so I invite you to read chapter 14, where he describes himself in his own words, Golden Eagle Rising. But as a settler, why I find this image so powerful is that the golden eagle, which represents resurgence and it represents prestige, but it's prestige based on revering and respect. It's not prestige based on fear. And the golden eagle is in front of words. You'll see the bronze words in the back. And what Shain has tried to do here is find equivalents in Canadian laws to Indigenous legal norms around leadership and respect and supporting others. And he wasn't able to find the exact equivalent. The closest he could come to was in mariner law, where if there's a boat that's stranded and another boat comes by, you're obligated by law to help the stranded boat. And so for him, that's what the golden eagle stands for, is that you help lift up others. And so it's a beautiful, beautiful message to impart.
Now for that. It's a shame that Shain couldn't join us today, but for your words on that, that's lovely. I want to pick up on, Maggie, your comments about tenure and promotion as an important stage, let's say, in anybody's journey through the ranks. And of course, those ranks in institutional terms can matter in regard to what sort of activities you can get up to, the things you can contribute. It is really quite important. It seems to me that, and I'm speaking to you as faculty members at your respective institutions, so you might know a bit about this. It puts me in mind of the role that the RSC has in relation to universities. So if, and I suppose if, can it be understood that if change is occurring at the university level, that not only is the RSC responsible for considering or confronting how it does something of some sort of equivalence. There's no T&P going on in the RSC, but there's certainly mechanisms for membership and nomination processes, and somebody, Marie, might have been brought up the manner through which people get adjudicated in their respective nominations. Is it so to put some sort of weight on the notion of T&P being an important issue for the university thing, do you reckon it has an outworking towards the RSC?
I do think there's an interplay between universities and RSC. We do some of the same things. So we adjudicate applications to determine, as Marie Batiste said earlier, to determine membership in the RSC in the same way as our colleagues in the universities determine who to hire and who to promote. And those standards, we've been pushing on those standards for a lot of years. But I would just add something slightly different, which is those standards are never applied universally. I mean, you will have watched people get hired who did not meet the standards. You will watch people who get promoted who did not meet the standards that are articulated. And you will watch people who were passed by without really any understanding of why they were disqualified. And so the standards are slippery. And I think they reflect the larger context and culture as much as any words. And we should be paying attention to the culture in an era of backlash. We've always had resistors. No matter how bad things get on the ground, there are always voices, dissenting voices who stand up and often pay a huge personal price for that, but nonetheless, they're always out there. There need to be lots of us backing them up as we argue about how these standards, these words are applied. And we need to ensure that they're applied inclusively. And I think that I wouldn't put all your efforts into the wording. I think that the context is equally important.
And of course, that context is brought to bear by those who are on the other side, standing in or sitting in judgment of what's before them, right? So it's as much, I'm trying to put this in a diplomatic way, because mention was made of the lack of people in the Academy of Sciences being, I forgot how you put it, Cynthia, but just active, let's say, in their observations or activities within Indigenous engagement. But I'm wondering if you can sort of elaborate, maybe not you, but anybody, about those orientations and how they affect how we stand in judgment of other people's efforts, education, experiences, and so on.
I think when we look at this project, we see it as a not a first step, because lots of steps have already taken place, but we definitely don't see it as the last word and the last step. And so when we put this call out, again, the people who come tend to be the people who are already reflecting on the process. It's no surprise that we have an educator and 3 historians on the editorial team of this book. You know, historians and educators. This is kind of what we do. It's our bread and our butter. I think it's harder for people, perhaps in the sciences, to do the methodological work that we're already sort of trained to do, which is the archival, the questioning, the looking. We understand the nature of bias. We understand how the very questions we ask already skew the answers. And so I think the what would need to happen to bring in more of the members of the Academy of Science is perhaps a conversational approach where we share our disciplinary expertise to doing that kind of institutional reckoning. Now, historians can go and read through, say, the Proceedings and Transactions, those series of books that the RSC produced for at least its first 50, if not the first, I guess, 100 years. But they we have there all these scientific reports put forward by RSC members to other RSC members. That would be a beginning. Is just to look through those would be worthwhile in itself.
An invitation to Indigenous peoples into the academic commons generally, and the RSC maybe specifically, requires, I'm not sure how to put it, but maybe a base apprehension of what Indigenous knowledge is, what its connection is to the disciplinary canon, let's say, and for some, and I'll pick on scientists maybe a little bit, at least locally, I get the most questions. I'm a classroom teacher by trade, and I still do PD, and most of the questions I get about anything that's related to Indigenous perspectives are from people who are struggling with how to situate that within the sciences, within chemistry, within physics, within biology is maybe a little bit further along with this area. So it seems to me that we care about our disciplinary. We're married to our disciplines, and maybe I'm making too much of this point, but I'm not sure I am. That being wedded to that may be affecting the way we see other sort of things. And maybe that's what you meant by biases, perhaps. Is that fair?
To an extent, I feel that it really should be Marie who is responding to this question, because Marie led within the RSC a group that was looking at transsystemic knowledge and really trying to push forward how the RSC can move beyond these disciplinary constraints to fully engage with in a positive, but also someone else said earlier about the importance of biodiversity, the biodiversity of language, the biodiversity of worldviews, of transsystemic knowledge. And Marie did a lot of work in that report to make it so that the RSC can do this in a way that brings down those disciplinary silos. But she pushes it even farther, because she's talking about the transsystemic knowledge, not just disciplines. Maria, I want to pass you the mic. So.
Hello? Oh, there we go. Yeah, well, I think that's the issue, is to recognize that Indigenous knowledge systems are not an addition or a adaptation of Western knowledge systems. Western knowledge systems are disciplinary knowledge traditions that are built around very siloed methodologies that each one adopts, and theories that go with them. In Indigenous knowledge systems are not systems that grow from methodologies, but grow from within a ancestral and continuous connection to land, to place, and on that is the cultivation of the knowledge through the stories, the storytellers, through the ancestral knowledge traditions that continue and are generated through and in communities. So how do we adjudicate and develop excellence-minded thinking around that when another knowledge system, such as Western knowledge systems, that is hierarchical and suggests that there are some excellent persons in there that should be honored and rewarded, whereas our lateral base of our knowledge systems recognizes and honors the knowledge holders without necessarily identifying them as the singular one that carries everything for the future generations. We all have then a role and responsibility as being part of that knowledge tradition to carry the knowledge forward in our own gifts and talents and be a participating member of that community in order to generate for the seventh generation the knowledge that we will hopefully have and they will have. To what extent can the development of a hierarchical giving of a Royal Society adjudicated process in the Royal Society, to what extent can that contribute to the ongoing knowledge dissemination and generation of our knowledges is a question that Indigenous peoples themselves must answer. That the knowledge systems reside in our communities and our elders and our languages and on the land. And so it is within our own communities that we have to ask the question, how do we adjudicate excellence? How do we understand excellence? And what do we do to honor those people who are excellent? And should we identify those, in what ways should we then now extend that to the Royal Society or other agencies to say, this is who we think is excellent and should be thus honored by you? Not through the adjudication of a peer-reviewed system, such as they go through, or the other ways in which they look for publications and specialization metrics, but to find ways that they will honor our selections in ways that honor the people who we consider to be our knowledge experts.
Yeah. I think that does relate to the progress that University of British Columbia has made, because although the word excellence may not be resonant in any of those discussions, sort of coming to terms with what constitutes important valued contributions by Indigenous peoples is what's at the heart there, and as well as what Marie just, so nya for that. Got some questions to get through here. Andrea asks, what was the RSC's response when to Cindy Blackstock's letter from leadership?
So Cindy Blackstock actually wrote a couple letters. The first letter, there was no answer to the first one. And so, unperturbed, she wrote it again. And then that time she made sure that more than one person got it. And one of the people that got it was Constance. And then Constance brought it to the then council of the RSC and said, we need to get an answer, and we need the answer now. And you held us to task, and that happened right away, the response. But the fact that she had to write more than once was in itself quite telling. Do you want to elaborate a bit on that, Constance?
It was an interesting time for the RSC because Cindy Blackstock was being celebrated as a new fellow that year. And so she used that, an admission into this hierarchical excellence system, to say, I'm here, and now you have to listen to me about bringing more. This is insufficient. And I thought, that's a very brave move. It takes a lot to get into the RSC, and then to stand there and represent communities that are out of their skill set and tell them they must expand. and include and rethink their perspective on the knowledge systems that they live by. We need more Cindy Blackstocks, and that will be the kind of power and voice that brings us through the next years.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, thank you for that. Got a question here about the let's say the ethos of the RSC in terms of symbolism and such. Ian asks about the language associated with the RSC, words like fellow and such. While seemingly mundane, he puts, these are core to RSC identity. Do you have any comments on that? I could add all yeah.
So
Okay.
I think fellow is one of the terms that we could discuss. Another one that gets floated is royal. At some point early on, the Royal Society, they realized they didn't have any women in it. And then they thought, okay, well, the Royal Society represents the excellence of people. And so there was a movement to have people say, men and women, right? But then they decided, no, let's just stick with people. And so the idea there was that you didn't have to specify, and therefore it could just remain a male organization. I think the first woman came in 1938, and the first Indigenous scholar that we know of came in 2007. So words do matter. So if we had been more specific, then maybe we could have contested it more openly. Fellow, that's a problem. Royal, I think it'll be interesting to have that conversation. We're a historic organization, and so we talked about toppling statues, changing names of streets. I just want to be very, very careful that when we topple and change names of streets, we're not whitewashing, that we're not ignoring the past. We have to be very, very clear that we remember that past. And that past is actively remembered, not passively remembered. Yeah.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And I think often, though, when we engage these questions of sort of symbolism and celebration, we're actually taking the past incredibly seriously. Like we're looking it in the eye. We are kind of facing up to its implications for our present. And that is, in fact, a really kind of rigorous engagement with history. And I think royal is something that we ought to think about. Fellow is something that we ought to think about. Our colleagues in Aotearoa have very much suggested a model about how some of those naming practices could be changed by an organization like the RSC. And I don't think we gain anything in a kind of failing to engage these questions. And in a sense, it sort of speaks to, I think, the kind of robustness of organizations that we kind of shift with time and with different priorities.
Yeah, I'm cool.
I hope you don't mind me building on that, but to let some further daylight in upon magic, it's not just the word, is it? Right? There's all kinds of lovely things that occur it'll happen this week, presumably, when new members are brought in. They get the whatever medal or little bit that they put on the lapel with the crown on it, which is lovely, but it is or can be understood to be connected with this sort of history. There's other elements too. You'll get a parchment, a certificate of sorts that's in a language I can't understand. It's in Latin, by the way, and there's other features that maybe don't come to mind right away, but these sort of transformations ought to be, as you suggest, Cynthia, perhaps something that we need to confront and discuss for sure. Just a few further points made by the audience before we break off here. I don't know, maybe this is something you just comment on, given Maggie's discussion about Indigenous scholars taking the lead in such things as Indigenous promotion exercises? Can this process be implemented in the selection of Indigenous fellows? I don't know if you have any observations on that.
Well, I think it's on. I think it's on. It is. The question of can the how fellows are selected and how college members are selected. I'll leave that to these good folks. And folks, I'm a college member, but I've cycled out. So with the college process, you're in for 7 years, and then I'm not too sure what happens after, but it's a 7-year appointment. So I had a little bit of experience with that, but other folks who have more experience with how the fellows are adjudicated can speak to this. But I mean, just generally, right? If you're going to, if you're wanting to have a selection process, whether it's, sort of a selection process, whether it's in the Royal Society or elsewhere, or whether you're going to have an adjudication process in the universities, which are looking at scholarship and looking at tenure and looking at promotion. And if you're thinking that Indigenous people are going to go through these processes, and if you want to ensure that there's some kind of authenticity, that there's some kind of legitimacy to those processes, in this day and age, there better darn well be Indigenous people on those panels and in those closed rooms. Because if they're not, the process itself should be called into question. That's my opinion. Like in today's day and age, at universities, in the Royal Society of Canada, whether it's at the college level or whether it's at the fellows level, if you're wanting to sort of bring in Indigenous presence, you're wanting to invite Indigenous people to be a part of the discussion and to be part of the society, and there's adjudication process, then it makes sense that there should be at least some person that's on the adjudication process that identifies as Indigenous and can speak to and can understand Indigenous scholarship or Indigenous research, so on and so forth. So that's my perspective. It's just, it's not a question, should there be? It's, let's hope in 2024 there is.
Yeah, I'll go. Thank you very much. I've got 2 devices in my hands here. The clock on the wall is beating us here, and I want to give us. Sorry? I am so sorry. I'm not even looking at the microphones, but we are short on time. But of course, yes.
Thank you, Frank, and I'm sorry to be right at the corner of your vision. I just wanted to add, having recently been in an administrative position, I had an opportunity to talk to a lot of junior Indigenous scholars. And when we look at tenure and promotion processes, when we look at Royal Society processes for admission, one of the first things is, do you have a journal article published? And I wanted to bring this up here because so many of the distinguished guests here have or currently are or have served on editorial boards. And what I'm hearing from young people is, well, I'm in the sciences, but when I try to publish on indigenizing my science, I can't find one of the ranked journals to accept that paper. I have to go to an Indigenous journal, and then that journal is not considered qualified, or qualifying, I should say, when I go up for tenure, when I go up to get a job. So as we talk about indigenizing the academy, we have to think about the very broad ecosystem of how peer review is done, because it's not only done in that room where we are making a hiring decision. Even before that decision starts, it's happening at our journal boards, and I don't think we're paying enough attention to that. Thank you very much.
Now, Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is David Garneau. I'm Métis. I'm an artist, a recent fellow, and very proud to be a Métis person in this group and artist as well. Not too many of us there. But when I went to the first meeting in Kingston, I didn't recognize this as being my space. This group here is my academy, right? We've got a whole range of ages, a whole range of backgrounds, and I hope we can just establish a more mentorship model. So a sovereign Indigenous mentorship college. Thank you.
I truly appreciate that, and the spirit in which you offer it is resident in a number of things that, again, I'll mention the knowledge systems report that was offered to the FRSC a few years ago does capture some of that, but I think I share your experience, which is what informed my contributions to us being here today, and I'm sure others share that. So this has been lovely. I really appreciate you coming and sharing with the book. Again, the book is Royally Wronged. It has been in your registration bags and such. Have a look. It's a good read. It's an interesting read, and might give you pause to consider some of the institutions that have been a part of, or we've taken for granted for in our current development. But there's a history there that we ought to confront. So Nyawagoa, thank you very much.